Global affairs analyst Michael Bociurkiw joins me now from Odessa in Ukraine. He is a former spokesperson for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Appreciate you being with us.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
And I do want to get to the future of military aid for Ukraine in just a moment. But first, let's look at what's happening on the ground right now with deadly Russian strikes in the Zaporizhia region, relentless bombings in Kharkiv, explosions in Odessa, where you are. With so many attacks on cities and towns across the country, what is life like for most people trying to live their lives in the midst of this conflict?
Sure. Well, it's in some places like Kharkiv, it's hell on earth, to put it bluntly. The feeling now is that the Russians are out to turn Kharkiv into another Mariupol, another gray zone where they flatten everything and people are forced out. Now, the mayor there insists that people are going to stay, 300,000 or whatever that remaining, but life has become very, very tough, as it has here in Odessa. I can't remember a time when we've had so many air raid sirens alarms, including overnight and including one just a few minutes ago. This causes a lot of fear, a lot of disruption. And let's remind everyone as well that where I sit right now in Odessa, the port here is a key component of the global food supply chain. If the Russians continue to strike at electrical plants, the port ceases to function. That will ripple down to consumers all over the world. It's a very sad state of affairs at the moment.
Right. And of course, Ukraine's President Zelensky says that without the $60 billion of US aid package, Ukraine will lose this war to Russia. But that aid looks increasingly unlikely, doesn't it? With many Republicans opposed to the aid for Ukraine and far-right politician Marjorie Taylor-Greene threatening to oust Speaker Mike Johnson if he supports any aid for Ukraine. So how likely is it that the Speaker would go ahead and pass any aid for the war-torn nation?
Sure. Well, it doesn't look very good at the moment. He has a very slim majority, and there's talk of forcing a House vote on the floor of Congress to get this through. There's also talk of amending the bill so that this $60 billion goes to Ukraine as a loan, which would, add to its already mountainous debt. The stakes couldn't be higher, and it's really felt here in Europe. Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, was actually in Florida talking to Mr. Trump, trying to talk some sense into him to, take away his opposition to this bill. And then Lord Cameron will go to Washington to lobby there as well. Both Lord Cameron and the French Foreign Secretary wrote a very, very strong op-ed saying that not only could Ukraine lose if this funding doesn't come through, but the West will feel this. Putin will continue his relentless advance further into Europe. It would trigger NATO action, boots on the ground here. It would disrupt supply chains, very, very disastrous for the West. So again, the stakes could not be higher.
Yeah, and of course, Republican resistance to any aid for Ukraine appears due to a Russian disinformation campaign, with the Republican chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, warning that Russian propaganda is infecting members of the GOP and influencing their views on funding for Ukraine. So how does that even happen, for starters? And how does Ukraine counter that Russian influence in the United States, within the Conservative Party?
I know, it's very difficult. Before coming on air, I went through the Twitter feed for #Ukraine, and you can see all of the disinformation bots at work there, calling Zelensky corrupt, Marjorie Taylor-Greene saying apparently that the Ukrainians are striking at churches and Christianity and things like that. Just ridiculous stuff. Look, the bottom line here is that the Russians have had a major advantage, pumping millions and millions of dollars into disinformation campaigns for years now. The Ukrainians are very far behind. One of the, Rosemary, one of the concepts in talks right now among Ukrainians is there are so many, for example, Ukrainian journalists who have been forced out of Ukraine that maybe it's time to get them motivated and hired to create high quality content to go around the world to counter this Russian propaganda. That's the kind of stuff going on, but I have to tell you, it's very overwhelming, the amount of disinformation on all of the social media platforms, and people, sadly, seem to be lapping it up.
Yes, so we all need to learn how to source our information. It is critical.
Indeed.
People are forgetting how to do that. Michael Bociurkiw, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.